Going to be a really cool talk about from Ka-Shing Davey, based on the research report that he did, Select Your Character, analysing factors that create the subconscious ties between the player and their virtual persona in fighting games. So there's some really cool slides here that I'm slightly jealous of. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. So Ka-Shing, would you like to come up and kind of present your paper?
Hello. So my research report was mainly about why people pick the characters they main in fighting games. And first, why I picked this. So I grew up playing fighting games. The first game I ever played was Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And growing up, my sisters always had like little girly magazines which are like, which celebrity are you? And I always kind of found that interesting, paralleling like why do I feel drawn to this certain character that I play? And the main reason was because I saw Jin Kazuma in Tekken 4 and I thought it was the coolest thing ever created, and I wanted to sort of delve into why I thought that. So before I get into the actual meat of the research report, I just want to kind of outline how I went about structuring it. So at the beginning, I have the abstract, which is basically just a summary of what you found out about the dissertation as a whole. But obviously, because that's what it is, you have to kind of write that last and then put it first. The introduction is where you start going into what you propose your method is for the dissertation, how you'll go about doing that. And then chapters 1 to 3 for me were just obviously the main body of work. You might have a fourth chapter or something. And then the conclusion is just summarizing it in a very neat and condensed way. And then after that you just have the bibliography where you just list sources and stuff. So firstly, the literature review. This is something I wish I had the most advice on before working on, because I didn't really have any sort of point of reference before doing it. It can look intimidating, but if you're struggling to kind of figure out what you're trying to say almost in your dissertation, you might have something you can waffle on about, but doing the literature review kind of helps you structure what you're trying to argue, and stuff like that. I think my main advice would be to basically break down what your source is and how to kind of talk about it. So for me, I had this original dissertation by Kokidi and Kagla, and it mentioned and compared two differing ideas between Bartle and Ferro. I ended up siding more with what Ferro was saying, so I looked into that essay, and then that essay was in turn basing its ideas off something mentioned by Fullerton. So yeah, I just kind of went back and back until I found the full picture idea of what was actually being discussed and how it was being proposed. So to kind of illustrate what I found out during the literature review, in that chapter I ended it by kind of discussing how Ferro's player types could be applied to character design. So I looked at the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in Shredder's Revenge and how they kind of represent the 5 main player groups. Mechanically, there's nothing actually that different about them in-game, but it's more just on personality. So Leonardo, the leader of the group, could be proposed to be the objectivist who is more focused on just achieving the end goal of the game, while Raphael, as the sort of aggressive lancer, is something who kind of wants to kind of assert sort of their abilities and prowess in the game. Donatello the Brains could be the inquisitive, who tries to kind of learn more about the mechanics and how they work. And then Michelangelo, who's the young fun one, is the creative who is basically just playing for fun and like the party dude. He's a party dude. And then April is like a friend of the group. She's like tangentially related to them, so she could be the humanist who involves themselves through social play. And so that was how I kind of brought chapter 1 together to sort of relate it to my later chapters and how I would go about using it. So my second chapter was all about clearly defining jargon in the fighting game community and introducing how it kind of functions. So I did this first by looking at the main fighting game archetypes that you might see in different series. The 4 main ones ended up being them, and I worked around assigning Pharaoh's player types to each of these archetypes. So Shotos are generally considered quite honest characters. They have very readable moves and usually have more easier to do execute inputs. So I liken them to objectivists and humanists for having very honest gameplay. Rushdown and grapplers, I thought, were very intense, very upfront kind of play styles. So I liken them to the dominants. And then zoners, very you keep your distance and you kind of try to maintain control, space control in the game. So again, I liken that to the objectivist. After that, I looked at more unconventional archetypes. These all have some sort of weird mechanic that separates them from the 4 main ones, and these ended up generally being more appealing, in my opinion, to the creators and inquisitors, as they ended up being more there was a further level of depth that you wouldn't get from the main group. To illustrate that, in the actual essay, I used a figure and a table, which also helped me kind of cut down on useless sort of not useless, but needless, a take up space in the actual word count, and it allowed me to constantly just refer back to figure 2, where I talk about one of the archetypes, and then I also included some examples just for better visual clarity. Moving on, I then talked about tier lists, which are pretty big discussion topics in fighting games. This is Ken from Street Fighter and Zafina from Tekken 8. They are generally considered, well, they're not from the same games, for starters, but Ken is generally considered very top tier for his game, and Zafina is usually considered quite low tier, and that's reflected in their player popularity. Ken is very consistently top 5. At the time I was writing it, he was 3rd most popular, even with the new DLC characters that had come out. And Zafina, I was very lucky about this actually, because I was quite worried I wouldn't get data for this, but as I was writing it, the director for Tekken released a video listing every character's rankings, and Zafina was 2nd to last, and she only beat Panda because it's a Kuma alternate. I don't even know. Anyway, so we can link this back to another detail being the skill ceiling for characters. Ken is a Shoto with a little bit of rushdown flavoring. So he has very readable moves, and the Hadoken, which is most likely recognizable to most people, whether they play fighting games or not, is generally considered one of the most easiest inputs to learn. It's just a quarter circle and then punch. And it has a lot of visual clarity. Zafina, on the other hand, is very weird. She has 4 different stances, and each of those different stances have different modes and different, completely different movesets. And if you're not totally familiar with Zafina, you might be doing a combo in one mode, but it would automatically put you into one of the other three, and it might mess you up. So I proposed 3 pillars of fighting game character selection for players, based on what I discussed in Chapter 2. The first one was perceived strength, and that is how your character measured up to everyone else in the roster. The skill ceiling, which is how difficult it was to learn that character, but thirdly, and arguably most importantly, was aesthetics, which was just generally how cool they looked. So the third chapter was me sort of like getting more into the nitty-gritty of the community itself. I kind of thought it was well and good like discussing all these character archetypes and talking about it, but it didn't have any sort of application unless I talked to the actual community itself. So I did an online survey with the case study of Tekken 8, because it was a very like popular mainstream fighting game with like an international cast, so it had like real world-ish applications. Originally I wanted to just look at the effect of the international cast, but the responses I got ended up making me like broaden out what I was talking about. So I started off the survey by talking about, I built the player profile. So I asked about the country of origin, their gender identity, and the online rank in the game, and who their main actually was. If I were to do it again, I would have asked about these, just to get like a broader appeal of like who I was getting responses from. The next big part were justifications as to why these characters were considered their mains, but I also wanted to open up the door for discussion on favourite character in general, in case that was different to who they actually mained, in case they thought just a different character was cooler, but another one was just mechanically more resonating. And then the third part of it was just me talking about national representation, how people felt about how their country was shown in the game. The main challenges of this was I was very reliant on people telling me the truth. I mean, someone could have just gone, yeah, I'm the highest ranking player in Tekken, and I play, I don't know, no one. I don't know. Anyway, there was that, and then if I wanted to ask more questions, I couldn't, so I had to sort of outline what all the questions I wanted to ask in the survey, and I didn't really want to be going back to it. And the main risks of it were like if the pool of responses was too small, then I couldn't use it. If it was too big, then I'd be having to sift through 1 million responses, which kind of did end up happening, because after barely a week, I got 300 responses from 50 different countries, and I had to close it because I didn't want to read any more than that. Spreading the survey was kind of fun. I did it by word of mouth at first, just talking to people at uni. So like, hey, if you play Tekken, do my survey. And then I went onto the uni Discord and stuff like that. But the main ones that I got most of the responses from were the Tekken Discord server and Reddit. But yeah, it was fun to do in the end. And I ended up getting this as like my main figure, where I sort of tallied up like topics that were brought up in these justifications and made this graph. Excuse me. So relating back to the pillars that I discussed earlier, game mechanics and aesthetics were the two main ones. But the third most popular one was loyalty, which was interesting because that's not something you can build without a pre-existing player base. And what I thought was most interesting about it is that the characters this was most discussed about were the original members from the first game. So I sort of suggested the idea that like with each installment where these characters reappear, this sort of idea of loyalty can only like get stronger as games go on. But the antithesis to this is the absence of a character, where if a character isn't there anymore, a player will have to kind of look elsewhere, or it can be as simple as a character not feeling as familiar as they did in a previous game to a current one, so they have to like move away from that. So all of this kind of like came together as I was looking at each of the different justifications into the fighting game community acculturation effort, which is basically the idea that with each game the community grows, and the idea should be that the developers sort of respond to that as they work on the game and update it. So when you have online communities discussing, you can work towards doing these sorts of combos with these characters and these moves, the game developers sort of like move towards helping that sort of cultivation to kind of amass a reliable fan base. And I sort of made evidence of that between the increase of moves between Tekken 2 and Tekken 3, and how that's kind of only gotten stronger with each game since. So how does that affect the games themselves? Well, on the left we have 3 characters who are generally considered easy to learn, easy to pick up, and should be considered like baby's first Tekken characters. And then on the right you have characters that are generally considered a little bit more complex and require a little bit more fine-tuning to kind of understand. So in the community, the characters on the left are generally considered low to mid-tier competitively, while the ones on the right are generally seen as higher top-tier characters. But if you look at rankings, the characters on the left generally appear more frequently in mid to high ranks, while the ones on the right appear across the board. So what you can suggest from that is that people who do choose these easy to learn characters will in turn get better at the game faster than those who go straight for the top tier characters who require like a highest, I don't know, you know what I mean. So on top of that, these higher skill ceiling characters sort of had this impression of being like really dominant on the field, being like really scary to go up against. And we can see this in actual public sports, as Mike Tyson was very open about, well, after his career as a boxer, he was very open about using fear tactics to kind of make an impression on an opponent to sort of rattle them beforehand. And that does lead back to this, but the sort of almost funny thing about this is that like you saw this quite a lot with the scarier looking characters. But on the left you have Ling Xiaoyu, who's a very petite, very clean faced woman compared to these like very highly detailed old men. And the kind of point that came up about it was that it was sort of humiliating to be beaten by like a dainty girl while you were like a big strong man. And that could be suggested to be reflective of inherent misogyny in the FGC itself. And you can see that pretty prominently in like how much of the player base is male. Like only 21% of participants in the survey identified as female. But women were more likely to be better at the game. So you can argue either girls are just better, or the women in the fighting game community stick around, tend to be more involved into the community and have like a stronger sort of like loyalty towards it. But in general, female representation in fighting games is not the best. This is the entire female cast of Tekken 8, and you can kind of tell that they look a little similar. Gameplay-wise, they are all different, but there's not a great variety in body types or even skin colors. Like the darkest you get is a little bit tanned. Tekken 7 did have a more, you could argue, had like a more diverse cast, but especially in this newest game, there's not much going on. The only exception to this, oh god, yeah. Bear with me. Oh my god. Yeah, it's just this over and over again. Right, yeah. The only exception to this is Panda, who's a bear. I mentioned this earlier, but Panda's the least used character in the game because there's Kuma, who's basically a male equivalent to this. And I was kind of, as I was writing the essay, I was kind of trying to think of like, in mainstream fighting games, who sort of like challenges this sort of lack of body type diversity in women. And the only one I could really come up with for popular games was Marissa in Street Fighter 6, who is huge. I think she is the biggest character in the game, and she uses pancreation, which is not. I don't think I've ever seen it used by a female character in any sort of game before. So yeah, cool. Next, the next most popular thing was Law, and the most popular kind of character for this was King, who is a luchador hero character. And when people were like talking about why they chose King, they were like, he's just the coolest dude ever. And that's reflected in his Law being a lot more heroic than most of the cast. Most of the cast just end up being like general like fighters wanting money, or they have like personal rivalries with like the government or whatever. But King's just a nice guy. He helps orphans. He was orphaned himself, and he has like rivalries with other characters. Yeah, but he more often than not tries to turn it into a friendship, which you do not see very often in this series at all. Actually, no, you do. Ignore me. So back to national representation. Most people ended up not caring too much about how their country was represented, and you can kind of tell by the imbalance of like how different countries appear. So the American and Japanese representation in the game is the most prevalent, and for the most part, it doesn't seem that integral to themselves as characters where they come from. As like most of the Japanese cast just end up being the main characters for the main central conflict of the game, and then the American characters hardly talk about being from their associated state. What was more discussed was things just being rather unsatisfying with their representation. Lily is supposed to be the representative of Monaco, but a lot of French participants sort of argued they just wanted her to be the French representative instead of Victor, or as well as Victor, as Monaco was such a small province next to France that it was basically just considered France. As well, you have our representative Steve Fox, who is meant to represent the UK as a whole, but he's very clearly just English. And you have Nina on the right, who is Irish, but most of the Irish participants didn't even know that she was Irish to begin with. And then we lean more into bad representation. Leo is pretty popular outside of Germany. A lot of people do like Leo, but if you're German, a lot of people ended up really not liking them because they had no sort of, their fighting style had nothing to do with German culture, and a lot of people really hated the voice actor for like overpronouncing things and just sounding generally non-German. And then a couple of Chinese participants also mentioned that they thought their characters felt sort of stereotypical and kind of based on like poor beliefs about the Chinese country. So the general conclusion were this list of how to like go about character design in general for fighting games. So it was diversifying play styles for various player types, creating interest in new content without alienating veteran fans, making more accessible characters inviting for beginners to get better at the game, and then broadening range of body silhouettes across male and female characters, and then framing those characters in a light that makes them more appealing beyond just gameplay, and then diversifying the cast without being either underwhelming or offensive to the player base as a whole. And that's what I came up with. So some general essay advice before I kind of finish up. Definitely Google Scholar and the NUA Library website. They will save your life. I don't know, you can't really do this without them. You can use non-academic sources and things like video essays. I definitely did, but I wouldn't make it your main, evidence and argument. Some general rules for writing that I usually follow. The main structure should kind of always be point, evidence, explanation. It's very easy to follow and it's very easy to work with. A practice I get into is trying to not repeat words in a paragraph that I'm writing, because when you do it, you kind of really look into and really analyze every single word you use, and it kind of encourages you more to use synonyms. And then obviously keep it formal. This is a formal dissertation, so you're obligated to do that. Embedded quotes helps you kind of maintain flow in the writing as you're like talking about it, and it sort of like brings a greater idea of you actually discussing and talking about the essay as you're talking about it. And signposting is just about one of the most important things you need to do, and it just helps. Well, what that means is basically just sort of signaling as you write before you start going into a topic how you're going to present it as an argument or whatever. And some magpie phrases. These are just like 3 things that I use quite a lot in my essays. Juxtapose is probably what I imagine most of you will use. It's just comparing 2 contrasting things, and then ostensibly is sort of just a nicer formal way to say obviously. And consciously constructs is just a cool way to say that a writer does something. I'm done. Yeah. If you have any more questions, you can probably find me on Discord as well, but I think that's me done.
Any questions? Yeah.
Obviously, you're writing about secular which is a constantly evolving game.
Yeah.
Would your results have changed drastically if you were to have done it today?
Oh my God, yes. Yes, there'd be so much different. Yeah, there's more characters. Yeah, they've made more characters, and the most recent update is weird, to say the least. So I'm very glad I did it at the time and not now, because I wouldn't want wanted to talk about Tekken 8. But yeah, it did feel like better to do like something that was very modern at the time. So yeah, it was the best route for me at the time.
I guess it is possible for your argument to become outdated quickly if you're dealing, especially if you're dealing with something very recent.
Yeah.
So that's okay, right? As long as you can make your argument valid at the moment that you're doing it, that's okay. I was going to ask you. So you implied at the end of the conclusion that the study helped you to kind of inform kind of best design practices for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So have you taken that forward in your final master's project?
Yeah.
And informed that?
So my FMP is a sort of like tactical RPG. So it has different kind of unit types, and so I've kind of gone a little bit more into how those things work together in tandem. I've kind of gone into player types for it, but it's more about how you can assemble units to kind of like move in these different ways.
So you just changed the genre, really,
Yeah.
but the idea of like the
But it's still applicable to like I feel like all sort of character design in games in general.
Yeah. There's several things I really liked about how you approach this. I love the table that you compiled with all of the detailed information. And like you say, a good table can save words, right?
Yeah.
Because you can constantly refer the readers back to it rather than explaining everything. And the words in the table won't count towards the word count. And I also loved that you you mapped all of those concepts onto the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, right? And it's like, I thought that was really interesting, and it's like, you know, it's a useful kind of like metaphor for it, I suppose, to help explain what you mean. And I think it speaks a lot about how I like to engage with you guys about your ideas, because if you came to me with like, oh, I'm writing something about fighting games, I don't really know what, I'm going to be like, I don't know if I'll help you very much. But if you come to me and say, I'm going to map all of these, with some crazy idea, like I'm going to map all of these fighting game styles onto the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, I'm going to be like, okay, I want to talk to you about this. Let's unpack this, right? You've brought a really cool idea to me. So try and think about how you can kind of creatively find a way into your topic, right? Which I think that's a really good way of doing. Any other questions from you guys? The breakdown of the literature review was really good as well, I thought. Let me see if I've got anything interesting. Oh yeah, I have one question. This is a survey-based kind of report, right? Do you think that if you had conducted qualitative interviews instead, or backed up what you've done here with qualitative interviews, you would have found out more different information, or do you regret not taking that method?
I do kind of wish I had at least a couple like in-person interviews. I would have liked to have talked to like interview like higher, like popular Tekken players, but I didn't really have the chance to do that.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing to do, but if you can do it, it would definitely have more validity to it.
Yeah. Did you apply for ethics clearance for your survey?
Nope.
You were naughty, weren't you? So, yes, I think looking back on it, I probably would have, if we did this again, I would have encouraged you to have filled in the ethics clearance form just to kind of validate the whole thing and, you know, protect you and your participants, because especially as you're dealing with issues like gender identity, sexuality, stuff like that, those kinds of things are considered like, you know, protected identity characteristics that, you know, could be considered sensitive, right? So we're tightening up on that a little bit, and I'll talk about that again in a second. But no, you managed to smuggle it over the line anyway, so that's good. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
We won't say anything now. Just pretend you did the ethics form.
Yeah, I did the ethics form, and you guys should all do the ethics form.
And I really liked as well the little bit about fear tactics and how you related it to real world boxers.
Yeah.
Were you tempted to go even further down the route of connecting this to real world sports?
Yeah, that section was longer, but then I did end up kind of realising it wasn't actually pertaining to anything to the dissertation itself, so I just kind of went, Mike Tyson does this, and then left it at that. But there's definitely a lot more in-depth. You can go into a lot of things, really. But obviously you only have so much time in the dissertation itself.
So it felt like the main thing in the dissertation was the nationality side of things and how you relate. Did that emerge as the most important thing over the course of the research, or did you think it would be at the start?
That's what I wanted to start my thing on, because Tekken to me was also always interesting for its diverse cast where everyone kind of speaks their native language.
Yeah.
And that's very important to Tekken's identity. A lot of people did say that, but it wasn't important to why people picked their characters. So what I ended up discussing in the research report itself was completely different to what I actually asked.
Interesting, yeah. Did you come across Rachel Hutchinson's article about Street Fighter and nationalism?
I did, yeah. It was in my references, but I didn't actually talk about it here. But
because I think that's interesting, because she makes the case that in Street Fighter you have this rivalry between Ken and Ryo. Is it Ken and Ryo?
Ryu, yeah.
Ryo and who's the American guy? It's Guile, right? But there's another American.
Ken's the American.
Yeah. But Ken's Street Fighter as well.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Okay, so Ken and Ryu, and it's meant to be this rivalry between Japan and America that plays out, across the decades, especially as Street Fighter starts up at a moment when there is that economic tension between the two countries. I wonder if what you found out could have helped you push back against the argument a bit. And it's actually, I found that people don't really care very much about the
something
nationalities.
that I did discuss in the dissertation was how there is a lacking feeling of patriotism, especially in America, because America was one of the biggest pools of answers I got, and I kind of talked about how not as many people felt proud to be American as they did back during Street Fighter 2 era time.
Interesting. I wonder if that's changed under Trump.
I think it's definitely changed under Trump.
Which is also the thing where it's the social world changes rapidly, right? So the study that you make in one moment might shift in another. So that's interesting too. That's and the British guy that appears in Tekken, Steve.
Oh, yeah, Steve, yeah.
And he's just got the Union Jack pants.
Yeah,
on,
he's rough.
Did he appear when did he appear? Because I feel like he might have appeared in the late 90s, early noughties?
Early noughties, yeah. His first game was Tekken 4, which, I think that's the early noughties.
So it almost he appears on the back of the Cool Britannia movement, right? Where the Spice Girls and it's British culture is being exported.
In Tekken 4, he definitely has that as a vibe. Yeah. Because he's in that sort of fashion still.
Yeah. So it kind of shows how these characters emerge in these particular little cultural moments as well. Great. Any final questions before we let Ka-Shing go? Yeah, back there. Oh, good question. So how to put the survey data in the report?
Okay, so obviously you saw the graph that I had, but as I was going through it, I did list the actual numbers, and then obviously the pool size was 300, so I did talk about how many people in that actually there were, and how that sort of affected how much. Yeah. I was talking about,
The bigger section seems to be the reflection on the data, and that's really, really important for a survey, I think. And also thinking about the drawbacks, is the sample size big enough? 300 seems really good, right?
Yeah, so it was pretty good.
You managed to circulate it on some forums and things like that?
Yeah, I wanted it to last a full month, but then I just got too much for me to do.
Too much to deal with,
It's a whole week just reading through everything.
Yes. Yeah, you can get too much sometimes, and that's why yes, no answers or answers on a scale of 1 to 5 are useful in surveys, because there's less to process cognitively, and also the other thing that you can do, and I think you did as well, is you had an appendix, right, where you had all of your survey data in the back. So that's the other thing that you can do. You can have an appendix where it's this is every question I asked and all of the responses I got. And because it's an appendix, it doesn't count towards the word count. Okay. So good example, good illustration of how to use survey data and methodology there, which is really good, and how to analyse it and talk about it and link it to an argument. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Excellent. Right.